The silence of deep space enveloped Ambassador Tay as he stared at the blinking red warning lights across his control panel. 3 days had passed since the catastrophic drive failure that left his diplomatic vessel crippled and adrift. The once elegant ship, pride of the Zintari Confederation's diplomatic fleet, now floated like dead weight between star systems. Distress signal broadcasting on all standard frequencies, the ship's computer announced in its flat tone. No response. Detected. Tay's slender fingers moved across the console, checking the signal strength once more. The beacon was working perfectly. The problem wasn't technical. It was statistical. This remote sector lay far from established trade routes, a calculated risk he'd taken to shave 2 days off his journey to the peace negotiations. The gamble had failed spectacularly when the experimental drive system overloaded, burning out critical navigation and propulsion systems. Computer, recalculate survival probability, Tay said, his voice steady despite knowing the answer. Current survival probability, 0.02%, the computer replied. Below threshold for rescue deployment per Confederation Directive 5591. Tay nodded slowly. The directive was clear and logical, as were all Zintari protocols. Rescue missions were only authorized when success probability exceeded 95%. Resources were finite. Lives were calculated assets. The mathematics of his situation were simple and irrefutable. The cabin temperature had dropped noticeably in the past hour as the life support systems diverted remaining power to maintain oxygen levels. Tay pulled his ceremonial diplomatic robe tighter around his shoulders. The intricate golden embroidery that marked his high status now seemed meaningless. In space, rank offered no protection against the cold void. Begin personal log, Tay said, settling into his command chair. Final entry. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Among his people, emotional displays were considered primitive, yet he found himself struggling to maintain composure. I, Ambassador, Tash, 22nd Diplomatic Envoy of the Zintari Confederation, record this final testament adrift in Sector 9 Lambda. My mission to negotiate peace between the Helio Alliance and Outer Rim territories ends here. His voice remained level, despite the weight of his words. The drive failure was immediate and complete. I followed emergency protocols precisely. Tay glanced at the stars visible through the viewport. They were beautiful and cold, indifferent to his fate. I understand and accept the Confederation's decision not to attempt rescue. The mathematics is sound. My life measured against the resources required and risks involved yields an unfavorable equation. He hesitated, then added, though I admit facing this equation from the diminishing side creates an unexpected emotional response. The lighting dimmed as another power system shut down to preserve critical functions. Tay could see his breath, now forming small clouds in the increasingly frigid air. For the record, I wish to note that my life in service to the Confederation has been fulfilling. I have negotiated 17 treaties and prevented 3 interstellar conflicts. My only regret is that my final mission remains uncompleted. A sharp pain in his fingers made Tay look down. The cold was becoming dangerous now. The environmental controls blinked amber, soon to turn red. With methodical care, he began shutting down non-essential systems to extend life support for as long as possible. It was a pointless exercise, perhaps, but it gave his trained mind something to focus on besides his imminent death. I have initiated power conservation protocols, he continued in his log. This will extend life support approximately 12 hours. I have also encrypted all diplomatic files with my personal key. Should this vessel ever be recovered, the Council will find all documentation in order. The precision of his planning brought a small measure of comfort. Even in death, Zintari maintained proper procedure. Tay opened a small compartment beneath his console and removed a personal item, a small translucent stone from his homeworld. It glowed faintly blue against his palm, the only warm thing in the rapidly cooling cabin. As is tradition, I leave my final thoughts, he spoke to the log. I do not fear what comes. My calculations have served the Confederation well. Our logic has built an empire among the stars. Yet, he turned the stone in his hand, watching light play across its surface. I find myself wondering if there are variables our equations cannot capture. The emergency lighting flickered, bathing the cabin in intermittent red. Tay's breathing had grown shallow, his body conserving energy as core temperature dropped. "Perhaps that is merely the biological response to ending," he whispered. The mind searching for hope where logic confirms there is none. He closed his eyes, stone clutched in his increasingly numb fingers. The ship's computer continued its dispassionate countdown of failing systems and diminishing life support. Outside, his distress beacon continued its futile cry into the void, broadcasting on all frequencies a message no one would hear in time. "For the record, and for whoever might find this vessel," Tay said softly, "I die as I lived, in service to the greater calculation. My people were right not to come. The numbers don't lie." What Tay couldn't know as consciousness began to fade was that not all species in the galaxy calculated risk the same way. And somewhere, much closer than probability suggested possible, a small human salvage vessel was about to make a decision that defied every Zintari statistical model. The cold had become a living thing, wrapping around Ambassador Tay like a predator. 18 hours had passed since his last log entry. The ship's life support systems clung to functionality by the thinnest margins, rerouting the last reserves of power to maintain minimal oxygen levels. The temperature had dropped well below what his species considered survivable. Tay drifted in and out of consciousness, his breathing shallow. Frost patterns formed on the inner walls of the cabin, beautiful crystalline structures that spelled his doom. His diplomatic training had prepared him for many scenarios, but it offered little comfort now. The mathematics of his situation remained unchanged, 0.02% survival probability, an acceptable loss by Zintari standards. "Warning," the computer's voice seemed distant, as though calling from the end of a long tunnel. "Oxygen levels at 12%, cerebral impairment imminent." Tay tried to focus on the console, but his vision blurred. His fingers, once nimble, enough to sign complex treaty documents, now felt thick and unresponsive. He had stopped shivering hours ago, a bad sign, he knew. His body was giving up. "Final power reserves redirected to life support," the computer announced. "Estimated time remaining 43 minutes. He closed his eyes. At least there was a certain dignity in knowing exactly when the end would come. No uncertainties. No false hopes. Just clean, precise numbers counting down. The soft beep nearly escaped his notice. At first, Tay thought it was another system failing, another step in the shutdown sequence. But the sound persisted, growing more insistent. Proximity. "Alert," the computer said, its voice cutting through his mental fog. "Unknown vessel approaching." Tay forced his eyes open. The sensor display showed a small craft moving toward his position at considerable speed. Impossible. No one should be in this sector. The statistical models had been clear. This region was empty of traffic. "Computer," his voice cracked from disuse and cold. "Verify sensor reading." Verified. Vessel approaching. Configuration unknown. Not in Confederation database. A hallucination, then. Oxygen deprivation created such visions, he knew. His mind was crafting a rescue fantasy as a final comfort. The communication system crackled with static, a sound Tay hadn't heard in days. The noise jolted him fully awake. This was no hallucination. Someone was trying to contact him on an outdated frequency that hadn't been used in Confederation space for decades. Diplomatic vessel. "Respond if..." "Hear this." Tay lunged for the communications panel, his numb fingers slipping on the controls. With effort, he adjusted the receiver to the obsolete bandwidth. "This is Captain Park of the independent salvage ship Dehan," a clear voice suddenly broke through. The accent was unmistakable, human. "We picked up your SOS. Your signal's weak, but we've got your position locked. Hold on, Ambassador. We're coming for you." Tay stared at the speaker in disbelief. Humans. Of all the species that might have heard his call, it had to be humans, the galaxy's most notorious probability defiers. "This is Ambassador Tay of the Zintari Confederation," he responded, his voice barely above a whisper. "My vessel is critically damaged, life support failing. I must warn you, rescue probability is calculated at 0.02%. There was a pause, then a sound Tay couldn't immediately identify. It took him a moment to realize the human was laughing. Good thing we don't bother with those kinds of calculations, Ambassador. We've pulled off worse odds before breakfast. The sensor display showed the approaching vessel more clearly now. It was small, perhaps a quarter the size of his diplomatic ship, and appeared to be cobbled together from mismatched parts. Nothing like the sleek uniformity of Confederation vessels. I don't understand, Tay said, struggling to process this development. This sector is empty. How did you find me? We were salvaging a derelict mining facility 2 systems over, Captain Park responded. Picked up your distress call about 10 hours ago and pushed our engines to get here. Looks like we made it just in time. Tay checked his ship's readings. My vessel has no functional docking mechanism. Atmosphere is failing. Rescue is not possible without... Let us worry about the how, Ambassador, Park interrupted. We've got equipment and we've got ideas. Docking isn't the only way to retrieve someone. Through the viewport, Tay could now see the human vessel approaching. It moved with surprising agility for something so asymmetrical in design. As it drew closer, he could make out patches and repairs across its hull, evidence of previous damage overcome. My ship's computer calculates that any rescue attempt would endanger your entire crew, Tay said, feeling obligated to warn them. The risk is, with respect, Ambassador, Park cut in. We're not much for letting computers tell us who we can and can't save. The human ship was alongside now, close enough that Tay could see figures moving behind its illuminated windows. They were preparing something in what appeared to be a cargo bay. We've got a visual on your vessel, Park's voice came through clearer now. Looks pretty banged up, but we've seen worse. My engineer says your hull integrity is holding in the main cabin. That gives us options. Tay watched in fascination as a hatch opened on the side of the human ship. A figure in an environmental suit emerged, propelled by some sort of handheld thruster pack. The movements were confident, practiced. That's Han, our EVA specialist, Park explained. He's going to assess your ship exterior and find us the best way in. Your crew member should not approach, Tay warned. My vessel's power core is unstable. Confederation safety protocols explicitly forbid. Ambassador, Park's voice softened. I understand you're worried about our safety. That's decent of you, but right now you need to focus on staying conscious. We can see your life support is failing. Your oxygen must be getting pretty thin in there. Tay couldn't argue with that assessment. His thoughts were becoming scattered, harder to organize. The cold no longer bothered him, another dangerous sign. I still don't understand, he murmured, more to himself than to Park. Why attempt this? The mathematics doesn't support the risk. There was a pause before Park responded. When she did, her voice carried a warmth that transcended the crackling communication system. Some things matter more than mathematics, Ambassador. No one gets left behind if we can help it. That's just who we are. Through increasingly blurry vision, Tay watched the human EVA specialist reach his ship and begin examining the hull near the emergency airlock. Against all probability, against all reasonable calculation, these humans had heard his call across the silent void of space. And they had come anyway. Ambassador Tay pressed his face against the viewport's icy surface, his breath fogging the already failing transparency. The human vessel, the Daihan, hovered impossibly close to his crippled diplomatic ship. By Zintari safety standards, the distance between the two crafts was criminally negligent, leaving barely 20 meters of space. Any miscalculation would result in a collision that could destroy both vessels. Computer, calculate collision probability at current distance, Tay whispered. Collision probability, 78%, the computer responded. Recommendation, immediate communication. To request increased separation, yet the humans maintained this precarious position with surprising steadiness. The Daihan's maneuvering thrusters fired in short, controlled bursts, compensating for the natural drift of space with a precision that seemed to defy the ship's cobbled-together appearance. Ambassador, you still with us? Captain Park's voice crackled through the comm system. Yes, Tay responded, his voice weaker than he intended. Your vessel is dangerously close. My computer recommends... Had to get close, Park interrupted. Your ship's leaking atmosphere from the rear section. We need to work fast before the structural integrity in your cabin gives out too. Tay watched as the cargo bay of the human vessel opened fully. Inside, a flurry of activity unfolded as crew members in environmental suits rushed about with purpose. Their movements lacked the methodical precision of Zintari emergency teams, yet contained an undeniable efficiency. "What are they doing?" he asked, curiosity momentarily overriding his discomfort. "Getting creative," Park replied. "Standard rescue protocols won't work here. Your ship design doesn't match our docking equipment, and your airlock's power is dead." Through the viewport, Tay could see a human in a distinctively patched suit directing the others. This figure pointed to different pieces of equipment, making quick hand gestures that the others responded to immediately. "That's Jin, our engineer," Park explained, as if sensing Tay's focus. "Best improvisational mechanic in 3 systems. She's figuring out how to get to you." Tay watched as Engineer Jin picked up what appeared to be a cutting tool never designed for space use, wrapped it in some kind of protective shielding, and handed it to another crew member. The casual modification of critical equipment sent a shiver of horror through him that had nothing to do with the cold. "Those tools," he said weakly, "they aren't rated for vacuum use. The safety certification process for void-appropriate tools requires—" A short laugh came through the comm. "Jin says if we waited for properly certified equipment, half the galaxy would be dead. Sometimes you gotta work with what you've got." Tai watched. Jin began assembling what looked like a bizarre hybrid of an airlock extension and a flexible tunnel. Parts that clearly originated from different manufacturers were being joined together with methods that would give any Zintari. "Safety Inspector heart failure. That connection method violates at least 12 Confederation safety protocols," Tay noted, unable to look away from the improvised engineering taking place before him. "Does it work, though?" Park countered. "That's the only question that matters, right now." Tay had no answer for that. In his experience, proper procedure and certified methods were inseparable from success. Yet these humans seemed to operate under entirely different assumptions. The ship's temperature dropped another degree, and Tay's vision blurred momentarily. The oxygen was getting dangerously thin now. He forced himself to focus on the humans' activities outside. Their determined movements became his anchor to consciousness. 3 crew members now floated freely between the vessels, secured only by tethers that looked alarmingly thin. They carried sections of the improvised tunnel, positioning them with careful adjustments. One nearly drifted into a jagged edge of Tai's damaged hull, but corrected with a quick burst from a handheld thruster, missing collision by centimeters. "Your crew member nearly—" Tai began, alarmed. "Lee's fine," Park assured him. "He used to race skimmers through asteroid fields for fun before joining my crew. This is nothing to him." Tay struggled to process this information. In his diplomatic role, he had met humans only in formal settings: negotiation tables, ceremonial functions, structured diplomatic exchanges. Those humans had seemed reasonably civilized, if somewhat emotionally unpredictable. But these humans, working in the void of space with casual disregard for protocols and seemingly improvising a rescue plan on the spot, they were something else entirely. His diplomatic briefings had mentioned humanity's reputation for innovative, problem-solving under pressure, and statistical anomalies in crisis response. Sterile phrases that utterly failed to capture the controlled chaos he now witnessed. Engineer Jin now approached his viewport directly, her face visible behind her. "Helmet Visa." She held up a tablet showing a diagram of what they planned to do. The technical details were lost on Tay in his oxygen-deprived state, but the general approach was clear. They intended to create a temporary passage between the vessels by cutting into his ship's hull near the emergency systems panel, bypassing the dead airlock entirely. She pointed to the diagram, then to herself, then gave a thumbs-up gesture. Through the comm, Park translated, "Jin says the connection will hold. We're going to cut in through your secondary maintenance panel. The atmospheric loss will be minimal if you can seal off your command cabin. Can you do that?" Tay dragged himself to the internal control panel. "Yes, command cabin has emergency bulkheads. Good, seal yourself in now. It's going to get noisy." Tay activated the emergency containment protocol. Reinforced barriers slid into place around the command cabin, with a solid thunk that reverberated through the ship's frame. Through the viewport, he could now see Jin approaching his hull with the modified cutting tool. Another crew member braced her from behind, while a third held a shield-like device to contain debris. The tool sparked to life, creating a small shower of glittering metal particles that scattered into the void. Your method is, Tay searched for a diplomatic term, unorthodox. Unorthodox keeps people alive when orthodox gives up, Park responded simply. As he watched Jin work with focused intensity, Tai reflected on his Confederation training. Throughout his career, he had faithfully adhered to protocols designed to minimize risk and maximize predictable outcomes. The Zintari approach to problem-solving was built on centuries of refined procedures, each step carefully calculated and verified. Yet here were humans, cutting into his ship with modified tools, working with equipment assembled from mismatched parts, standing in direct defiance of overwhelming statistical improbability, and somehow making progress. "Ambassador, stay with us." Park's voice pulled him back from the edge of unconsciousness. "Jin's almost through. Talk to me. Tell me about the first time you met humans." "Trade negotiation," Tay mumbled, fighting to stay alert. 10 years ago. Your ambassador insisted on serving beverages during serious discussions. Highly irregular." Park's laugh came through clearly. "That sounds like us, always mixing business with the personal touch." Outside the viewport, sparks continued to fly as Jin's cutting tool worked through the hull material. Tay watched with fading consciousness, mesmerized by this display of humanity's legendary disregard for impossible odds. A harsh grinding sound jolted Ambassador Tay fully awake. Through the viewport, he could see Engineer Jin's cutting tool finally break through the last section of his ship's hull. The modified equipment had done its job despite all probability calculations suggesting it shouldn't have. A perfect, circular hole now gaped in the side of his once pristine diplomatic vessel. "We're through," Jin's voice came over the comm for the first time. Her tone was matter-of-fact, as though cutting holes in spacecraft was routine work. "Beginning tunnel attachment. Now." Tay watched in fascination as the crew pushed the flexible passage. A bizarre patchwork of emergency materials, salvaged parts, and what appeared to be industrial-grade fabric toward the newly created opening. The makeshift tunnel looked nothing like the standardized emergency transfer systems used in Confederation space, yet the humans handled it with confident precision. "Ambassador," Captain Park's voice returned, "your ship's structural integrity is worse than we thought. The cut we made has triggered some cascading failures in your hull. We need to move fast." As if to emphasize her point, a deep shudder ran through the diplomatic vessel. Tay grabbed his console for support as warning lights flashed across his remaining systems, hull breach expanding beyond containment parameters, his ship's computer announced with characteristic calm. "Command cabin atmosphere venting. Estimated time to total decompression, 12 minutes. "Did you hear that, Captain?" Tay asked, a hint of panic finally breaking through his diplomatic reserve. "We heard," Park responded grimly. "Change of plans. The tunnel isn't going to work with that rate of structural failure." Through the viewport, Tay could see the human crew quickly pulling back the half-attached passage. They moved with remarkable coordination, as though they had rehearsed for this exact scenario. Had they? Or was this another example of the human capacity for adaptation that so puzzled his species? "What's the alternative?" Tay asked, his breathing becoming more labored as the cabin pressure dropped noticeably. "Direct EVA transfer," Park said. "I'm coming over personally." A chill that had nothing to do with the failing temperature control ran through Tay. EVA transfer, crossing open space between vessels, was considered an absolute last resort even among the Confederation's most elite emergency response teams. The statistical risk of death exceeded 60%, even under ideal conditions. These conditions were far from ideal. "That's not advisable," Tay managed. "The risk assessment—" "Ambassador," Park cut him off gently. "With all due respect to your risk assessments, they don't account for my crew's experience. We've done this before." As they spoke, Tay could see a figure emerging from the Dehan's airlock. Unlike the other crew members, this one carried a bulky cylindrical object strapped to their back. "That's me you see heading over," Park confirmed. "And that thing on my back is going to keep you alive." The captain navigated the space between ships with surprising grace, using controlled bursts from her handheld maneuvering unit. She avoided debris from the cutting operation with small adjustments that seemed almost instinctive. Within moments, She reached the cutout section of hull and peered into the ship. "I can see you through the internal viewport," she said. "I'm at your maintenance access point. You need to unseal your command cabin so I can reach you." Another violent shudder ran through the ship. The viewport beside Tay cracked, a thin line spreading across its surface like slow lightning. "Viewport structural integrity compromised," the computer warned. "Immediate evacuation recommended." "Ambassador," Park's voice grew urgent. "Open the bulkhead now." With trembling fingers, Tay entered the override code. The emergency bulkhead slid open with a hydraulic hiss, and immediately the atmosphere in the command cabin began rushing out more quickly. His ears popped painfully as the pressure dropped. Park pulled herself through the maintenance access and into the corridor beyond. Now that she was inside his ship, Tay could see her clearly through the internal window separating the command cabin from the corridor. Her environmental suit was as patched and modified as the rest of her ship, with hand-painted markings and non-standard attachments. She worked quickly, securing the bulky cylinder from her back and positioning it by the cabin door. With practiced movements, she attached a control panel and activated a sequence. "This is a personal environmental pod," her voice explained through the comm. "We modified it for Zintari physiology on the way over." Modified it? Ty's scientific curiosity momentarily overcame his fear. How could you possibly adapt human equipment for Zintari biological requirements in such a short time? "Jin studied xenobiology before turning to engineering," Park said, continuing to work as she spoke. "And we had your Confederation diplomatic profile in our database. Basic physiological needs aren't that different. Oxygen mix is the main thing we had to adjust." The pod expanded from its compressed state, forming what looked like a survival cocoon large enough for one person. Even through his oxygen-deprived haze, Tay could appreciate the ingenuity of the design. It was crude compared to Confederation emergency equipment, yet its adaptability was remarkable. "This will keep you alive during transit," Park explained, motioning him toward the cabin door. "I need you to get in quickly. Your ship doesn't have much time." As if to confirm her assessment, another section of hull gave way somewhere in the ship. The entire structure groaned like a dying animal. Tay hesitated. "The statistical probability of successful transit must be—" "Look," Park interrupted, her face visible through her helmet visor. "I don't know what the statistics say, and frankly, I don't care. What I do know is that if you stay here, you die for certain. If you come with me, you might live. Those are the only numbers that matter right now." Tay stared at her, seeing something in her expression he hadn't expected. Not just determination, but a kind of moral certainty that transcended calculation. "Why?" he asked simply, the question that had plagued him since first hearing their transmission. "Why risk yourselves for me? We've never met. I'm not your species. There's no political advantage, no material gain." Park's eyes softened. "We picked up your call while salvaging nearby. We couldn't just leave you. That's not what humans do." As the ship shuddered around them, Tay considered her words. The concept seemed alien to him, risking multiple lives for a single stranger with minimal survival probability. It challenged everything in his cultural framework, everything he had been taught about rational decision-making. Yet here she was, this human captain, breaking every rule of calculated risk, defying statistical certainty, all for a stranger's life. "The pod is ready," Park said, motioning urgently toward the expanded cocoon. "We need to move now." Another viewport cracked. Time had run out. Tay took a deep breath of the thinning air and made his decision. He moved toward the cabin door, toward this impossible human rescue, stepping away from the certainty of numbers into the uncertain promise of survival. "How do we do this?" he asked. Park's smile was visible even through her helmet. "One step at a time, Ambassador. That's how humans handle impossible things." The great chamber of the Zintari High Council fell silent as Ambassador Tai stepped onto the speaking platform. The curved walls, designed to amplify sound for optimal communication efficiency, now carried only the soft rustle of ceremonial robes as the 12 council members leaned forward in their seats. This was unprecedented. An official whose survival Probability had been calculated at 0.02% now stood before them, alive and prepared to deliver a report. "Honored Council," Tay began, his voice stronger than it had been in the weeks since his rescue. "I come before you to present testimony regarding the loss of diplomatic vessel harmony and the subsequent events that challenge our fundamental understanding of interspecies relations. High Counselor Minu, the eldest and most respected of the 12 raised a hand. Before you continue, Ambassador, the Council wishes to formally acknowledge the statistical anomaly of your survival. It defies all calculated models." Tay inclined his head in acknowledgement. "Indeed, Counselor, what I am about to share will require us to reconsider many of our most basic assumptions." He activated the chamber's holographic display, which immediately projected the image of a small asymmetrical vessel constructed of mismatched parts. "This is the independent human salvage ship Dehan," Tay explained, "crewed by 6 humans under the command of Captain Park. This vessel and its crew are responsible for my presence before you today." "A salvage ship," Counselor Wren interjected, his tone colored with disbelief. "Not an official rescue vessel?" "Correct," Tay confirmed. "The Dehan is a private commercial vessel with no governmental affiliation. They were conducting salvage operations 2 systems away when they detected my distress signal. And they diverted their commercial activities for a 0.02% probability rescue?" Counselor Lin asked, her voice carrying the mathematical puzzlement felt throughout the chamber. "They did," Tay said simply. "When I questioned this decision, Captain Park informed me that statistical calculations played no role in their choice to attempt rescue." A murmur rippled through the council. The Zintari, equivalent of shocked outrage, for a species that had built their entire civilization on the foundation of probabilistic reasoning, the concept was almost incomprehensible. Tai continued, "Using improvised equipment and modifications to standard tools that would never pass. Our safety certifications, they cut through the hull of the Harmony and extracted me via direct EVA transfer in an environmental pod adapted for Zintari physiology." He gestured, and the holographic display shifted to show imagery taken during his rescue. Engineer Jin cutting through the hull with modified equipment, the flexible tunnel attempt, and finally, the environmental pod that had preserved his life during the dangerous crossing between vessels. Our traditional allies, with their certified emergency equipment and trained rescue specialists, were not the ones who responded to my distress call, Tay noted. They followed proper protocol, determining that the mathematical probability did not justify deployment of resources. He paused, allowing the Council to fully absorb this implicit criticism. It was a bold move for a diplomatic official, but his recent brush with death had altered his perspective on diplomatic caution. "But there is more," Tay continued. "After securing my safety aboard their vessel, Captain Park and Engineer Jin returned to the Harmony, despite clear indications that the ship was reaching critical structural failure. They did this to recover what they called the important stuff." The holographic display changed again, showing the diplomatic data core that had contained all records of Tay's peace negotiation preparations. This data core contains the complete framework for the peace agreement between the Helio Alliance and the Outer Rim territories, work that represented 2 years of preliminary negotiations. By all logical calculations, the risk of returning to a failing vessel to recover data was not justified by any measure of human self-interest. Counselor Minu leaned forward. "Why did they do it then?" "I asked them this same question," Tay replied. "Captain Park told me that they understood what the diplomatic mission meant, not just to me personally, but to the stability of the sector. She said, and I quote directly, 'Peace is worth a little risk.'" Another murmur, softer this time, moved through the council chamber. "During my recovery period aboard the Dehan," Tay continued, "I had the opportunity to observe human decision-making, processes firsthand. Their approach defies our probabilistic models in ways that both confound and illuminate. They operate on a system they call judgment calls and gut feelings that somehow incorporate variables our equations cannot quantify. Surely this is simply evidence of primitive decision-making," Counselor Wren suggested. "A species still relying on evolutionary impulses rather than refined calculation." Tay shook his head firmly. With respect, Counselor, that was my initial assessment as well, but I have come to believe there is something more sophisticated at work, something our mathematical models failed to capture. He stepped away from the holographic controls and moved to the center of the speaking platform, an unusual break from protocol that emphasized the personal nature of his next words. Engineer Jin repaired my personal communicator despite having no training in Zintari technology. When I asked how she managed this feat, she said she figured it out as she went. Captain Park navigated a debris field that our simulators would calculate as impassable. The ship's medic adapted their treatment protocols for my physiology with what they called creative adaptation. Tay took a deep breath before continuing. Most significantly, when I asked why they would risk 6 lives to save one, a clear mathematical inefficiency, Captain Park appeared genuinely confused by the question. Because it's the right thing to do, she said. They call this concept basic decency, a moral imperative that exists independent of statistical calculation. This is merely emotional thinking, Counselor Lin objected, irrational and unsustainable. Is it? Tay challenged gently. The humans of the Daihan have completed 14 rescue operations in the past standard year. Their success rate defies all statistical models. Something in their approach, this blend of technical creativity, adaptive problem-solving and moral certainty, produces outcomes that our equations predict as impossible. He returned to the holographic controls and displayed his final slide, a proposed framework for joint rescue protocols between Zintari emergency services and human vessels. I come before you today not merely to report on my improbable survival, but to recommend a fundamental reassessment of our relationship with humanity. Their approach contains elements we would benefit from understanding and perhaps selectively incorporating into our own methodologies. The council chamber remained silent as the 12 most powerful figures in the Confederation considered his words. After a moment that seemed to stretch into infinity, High Counselor Minu spoke. You are suggesting that we, the Zintari Confederation, architects of the most sophisticated probabilistic reasoning systems in known space, have something to learn from humans, a species that makes decisions based on feelings. Yes, Tay said simply. I believe we do. He gestured to the empty space beside him. The mathematical certainty was that I would not be standing here today. Yet here I am, in the cold emptiness of space, when all probable outcomes pointed to my death. It was not our advanced allies with their certified equipment who answered my call. It was humans who refused to accept silence as final. Tay squared his shoulders and delivered his conclusion, with the quiet confidence of someone who had stared into the void and returned. The universe, it seems, does not always conform to our equations. Perhaps it is time we expanded our calculations to include variables we have previously dismissed as intangible. The humans call one such variable hope. After my experience, I find I can no longer dismiss it as irrelevant to the equation.